Don't wait till the battle's over. Don't wait till the struggle ends. Shout out, shout out, right now. Shout out, shout out. Don't wait till you make it.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Phillip Show. If you haven't already grabbed your coffee, oh my goodness. So in the conversation now, you know, there's a lot of national conversation, and I use that phrase a lot because there are more people talking about the things that you and I are talking about here than just us. And we want to make sure that we're relevant in what's going on out there. We know that COVID happened, and we know that we're moving forward into some sort of season, but we also know that there was a lot of loss during some of our seasons. There's a lot of grief in some of our seasons, and mental health awareness and the opportunity to find help, find support, find resources is, in my perspective, at an all-time high. I haven't seen it so prevalent in media, in personal conversations, but there is still something to process when it comes to how do I move past grief? How do I identify it? What does this mean for me if I lost someone, a loved one, a coworker? What does that mean? And where does my permission start to be able to process it? What is it supposed to do? What are the expectations? And how am I supposed to do that in a safe way to be on my journey to healing? And I'm super excited today because today we have grief mending coach and owner of From Grief to Life. Ahira Smith is here, and From Grief to Life is a hybrid grief coaching business. Ahira.
Grand Rising, how are you?
I'm doing well. I got my coffee here. It looks like, where are you right now?
You know what? I'm in a coffee shop right now. So, I figured, because I don't drink coffee, so I was trying to pay homage to you since you're about that coffee life and I'm not a coffee drinker. So I was like, you know what? Let me create this Zen. Yes, thank you.
Let me pour an espresso shout out for my homies.
Thank you.
Oh my goodness. So I love the fact that you're in a coffee shop because you're in a place where a lot of life happens. One of the things that I enjoy about coffee shops is I can make up scenarios for people who are sitting beside me. I work often in them, and it's like, I wonder what their life is doing. I wonder what they're processing. I wonder what business adventure they're about to go on. And what we're talking about today is how we handle grief. And I'm sure many people are handling it all the time around us, and we have no idea about it.
True. Very true. It's interesting because we are dealing with a lot of life happenings, and we just never know what people's journeys have been like. Regarding grief, the first thing that comes to people's mind when we're talking about grief is like, oh, somebody died. But it's bigger than that. It is way bigger than that, and COVID, the pandemic itself really tore the Band-Aid off when it came to grief because of the fact is that, yes, we did lose a lot of loved ones who transitioned, unfortunately from COVID itself, or perhaps they might have been sick for other reasons, like maybe cancer, or maybe it was just, various different reasons, and they passed away during the pandemic. But when I tell you that there has been so much grief from people who've lost their jobs because of COVID and the pandemic, people who've lost their homes because of the pandemic, people who have broken up relationships, marriages have ended during the pandemic, people who've also lost their own optimum health, people who might have been running marathons before COVID came into their world. And then unfortunately they might have been infected with COVID, and now they can barely walk a mile, let alone run a marathon. All of that embodies that of grief. And so what I have done is take it upon myself. Well, let me be transparent.
Yeah. Lay it on us.
So I have had my own grief journey. Okay. I've been through some major losses in terms of losing loved ones and just life happening. And so as I was navigating through my own grief journey, there have people who tended to gravitate towards me and talk with me about their own losses and their own grief, ups and downs. And somebody had suggested that I even go into this field, and I would look at them half crazy, like,
Mm.
excuse me, I don't want me a grief coach. What? Why? No, I
Well,
don't.
it has to sound, it has to sound overwhelming coming from something that is so emotional, like grief,
Absolutely.
like loss, and then to say, hey, I'm going to plant myself in it on purpose and talk about it on purpose. That has to be kind of like, well, no.
Let me tell you something. This wasn't my on purpose. This was the high above on purpose.
Got it.
When I tell you this was an assignment that was given to me,
Mm,
and
I got
trust
you.
me, I was trying to run away from it for a minute. I'm like, no, I don't want to talk about grief. I'm trying to be happy and trying to be, be in the moment. I'm not trying to be in grief. But what I have found though is that I'm comfortable
Hmm.
with grief. I'm very comfortable with it. I can recognize it.
Mm,
I think in part because I am an empath. But when I say that this was something, it chose me
mm.
because I didn't choose it. I mean that. And so here I am today bringing, conversations to people about something that we just don't talk about, especially in the African American community.
Yes.
But, and in this society itself. But yeah, that's when I'm here.
So when you stepped into, well, wait a minute, let me back up. I want to know, how did you decide to say yes to this awkward and I would imagine uncomfortable call to step into grief? What was it about this that said, you know what, even though it kind of hurts me, even though it's hurting, even though I'm in my own process, I do believe that this is where I'm going to make an impact.
Okay, so prior to becoming a grief coach, I worked in higher education for almost 20 years,
Okay.
and I saw a lot,
Mm,
and I witnessed even more behind the surfaces. So when I was engaging in different conversations, especially with young people and students, there was a lot of grief that was not being addressed. And 9 times out of 10, the topic doesn't even come about unless something major happens. For an example, if everybody has been made aware the past couple of days, there was an incident that took place down in Jacksonville, Florida at Edward Waters University, where a gunman was on the campus of Edward Waters University, and where there was a campus officer who approached the gunman on the campus, where he fled away, only to end up at a local Dollar General store and unfortunately killed 3 people.
mm,
So when that happens so close to home, especially on colleges and universities, that's when they'll start like offering counseling services. Here's something we could talk about, and we're made available. I mean, even the other day, unfortunately, University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill had a gunman, an active shooter on their campus where they killed a faculty
mm.
member. And again, that's when the counseling services will come into play. That's when all these resources outside, local resources outside, will come in and make themselves available should anyone want to talk about something of that magnitude.
Yeah.
But what happens after the weeks go by? What happens when something else comes about and it triggers something that's happened for someone in the past and it's
Mm,
not being addressed? And I'm not saying that the counseling services are not there present, but more than likely people are not going to feel inclined to go and talk to them about it.
mm.
It's one of those things where, if the students or if the people don't come to the mountaintop, then the mountaintop got to come to them and
Right.
let them be known like this is a safe place. We're going to have these conversations and let's get into it. So.
I know that on your website, From Grief to Life, there are some facts and myths. And something just hit me when you were talking about that there would be grief counselors set up for the immediacy of the moment. This just happened. Now come talk about it. Is there a misconception that you have to deal with the grief in the moment? Because I would imagine that sometimes it takes somebody a minute to process what just happened. And then some of the fallout of that is going to be processing after the fact.
Let's be clear. There is no timetable when it comes to grief. Everybody grieves differently. There's no blueprint to this. The way I grieve is going to be different than the way you grieve.
Yeah.
Even it all stems from a lot of different factors. It could have been the relationship you had with that person. It could have been the circumstances behind that person. The way you grieve about somebody who died tragically in a car accident that was instantaneous may be different versus somebody who's been battling cancer for the last 5 years. You know, there's different types of griefs on top of grief itself. You know, there's something called, for an example, anticipatory grief, where a caretaker who's been working with somebody who who helped with somebody who's maybe dealing with dementia or Alzheimer's, and they see their health or their patients slowly declining the last 4 or 5 years until, you know, they make that transition. That's a grief in itself, you know? And then when you're talking about things like a secondary losses of grief, a spouse might have laid their loved one to rest. Well, guess what? Every Friday was date night. So when there's no longer date night, you know, who are they going to talk to about the household bills? Or what are they going to do when the grandkids come over for the holidays? Those are secondary losses that come into play. So the way I grieve and the way that you grieve or anybody grieves, it's different. And even if we take the historical content, especially in this country as African Americans, let's be clear. Our ancestors were in a position where if they cried out, they would be punished. They would be whooped. They would be sold. They would be raped. They would be lynched. Their kids would be taken away. So we couldn't even cry out when it came to grief. We had to suffer. We had to hold it all in before we can even release it. Otherwise, there's a backlash, you know? And so it differs. There's no getting around it. Let me just say that, and let me be clear. People try to be like, "Oh, I'll just get over it," or people like, "Oh, just get over it." No, you shut up. Excuse my language. You hush. Though there's no such thing as getting over it. You don't know the relationship I have with my mom. You don't know the relationship he has with his dad. You don't know that, you know. So it's not something you can get over. You can't get around it. You can't get underneath it. What you're going to have to do is walk through it. You can't run through it. You got to walk through it in order for you to get to a place where you recognize the fact that this is a grief that you give yourself permission to do. You got to give yourself permission to grieve. That's the first and foremost. It's not something where, Phillip, you tell me to grieve now. I'm like, okay, sure. No, it don't work like that. I have to give myself the permission to grieve. And then the second thing you need to do is honor that grief. Recognize it. It's important to. I learned that from one of my past guests on my own podcast, where she was talking about her own relationship with her father and how much she had to honor that grief in itself, and it definitely embodies on what it is that I'm doing in my role as a grief coach. And then once you give yourself permission to truly grieve, once you honor the grief itself, then when you're heading closer towards that healing component or that positive light, you're going to get to a place, a safe place where you're going to recognize that, guess what? There's greatness in grief.
As a coach, I'm sure you see and you hear a lot of different equations that make up somebody's grief scenario, different components. In listening to you, you know, it opened my mind because you're saying it's not just a loss of a loved one. You can be grieving something different. You could be in the grief process over something that's not traditionally thought of to be grieved about. When somebody reaches out to you, I guess the question would be, how do I know how do I know I'm grieving? You know, like some people look at people and be like, oh, so and so just died. How do I know if I'm grieving something? What are some of the tells that say, hey, I think you're in a process of some sort of loss, and it sometimes manifests its way in this sort of activity?
We grieve because we love.
Hmm.
So if you loved a particular job, and unfortunately, due to circumstances that are beyond your control, they laid you off,
Hmm.
you're going to grieve that relationship that you built with that company or that organization. You're going to grieve the loss of the camaraderie that you had with those people that you worked with. So that in itself, in itself is a state of grief.
Mm.
If you had a pet and you had that puppy from 6 weeks of age until they were 13 years old, and then for whatever reason they're just suffering, and you had to put them down because you didn't want them to suffer no more. There wasn't anything else you can do to help them. That's a grief in itself, because to some people that puppy might, or that dog might have been their child, you know. For somebody who might not have been able to have children, or because their children might have grown, they might, you know, had something else to care for and to nourish and love and nurture. So it looks different. You know, that it's similar to that of, even when you're thinking of depression. Depression definitely is a component within the grief realm, because of the fact the circumstances, you know, really tend to call for it, especially if you are not truly honest with yourself. That's why I'm saying giving yourself permission to grieve.
Yeah.
If you're in denial, then it's going to be like, oh, I'm okay. And I'm like, okay, for the moment. And please understand that everybody grieves differently. As I said before, it's not going to be the same for me versus you, or anybody for that matter. There are some people who are outright pouring their hearts out, and there are some people who are internalizing it. Is that a bad way? No. Is it a healthy way? Maybe. It just depends. Everybody grieves differently. I've known many people who have lost parents, and they don't grieve outwardly as say I would, but that doesn't mean that their state of mind is not there.
Yeah.
So it just really depends.
One of the things that I think is interesting when it comes to anything that's either mental health or emotionally based is sometimes people have a hard time seeing a point of resolve, or a point of resolution, or a point of moving past, through, when it comes to grief. And when you coach people, what is it like to identify that process to say it takes this long? You'll know you're done grieving if this happens. Is there an end to it? And how do you know?
This is just my belief.
Yeah.
Grief is part of the journey.
Mm.
You're always going to be grieving about something. You may not be grieving as heavily right now with the loss of your spouse. However, time is doing its job, which is giving you that space to take a breather, or to take one step forward, or to engage in something that's a bit more of a happier component.
Yeah.
And then 5 years have passed before you know it. 5 years have passed, and so when that person's birthday comes up, or that anniversary comes up, it may not be as painful as it initially was. But you're going to continue to grieve because you love that person.
Right.
You love that pet. You appreciated that job, or you love that house that unfortunately got swept away because of the fires, or you know, that's you can't expect to get over something in a few months' time when you spent years building.
Sure.
Doesn't
And
make
yeah,
sense.
that emotional investment, you're connected to the
Absolutely.
emotional investment, you're connected to
Absolutely.
the thought of the future, you're connected to all of these pieces
Exactly.
to that.
Exactly. That's where
Yeah.
and again, that's where that secondary losses of grief come into play, because that continues to be the case. I mean, even for somebody like myself, when I had a miscarriage, for me, I didn't get to hold my child,
Mm.
but the thought of me becoming a mother has always been in my plan for years. And so even though I was able to carry my child for a certain length of time, because though she's no longer here, that doesn't mean I'm over it per
Yeah.
se. It doesn't. If anything, I love her more because I know I know what she could have been, or I
Mhm.
would have loved to have seen her do things that I envisioned, because it's something that I've had for years before I even knew I was pregnant.
Yeah.
So it just really differs.
We as the public, perceptually, we have a hard time allowing people space and allowing people time and allowing people to display emotions or behaviors that either we disagree with or we don't understand. As somebody who may be they may have the knowledge of somebody who lost something and they kind of know they're going through the grief process, what is something that they can do to support somebody they know is going through that process?
There's a component that's missing in these conversations, if they're even being had, and that's empathy.
Yeah.
Empathy is essential. A lot of times, for those who were raised in a certain manner, especially those who were raised in a religious background, spiritual beliefs, the old way of doing things was like, oh, well, just take it to the altar,
Hmm.
take it to God, leave it there. It's a foundation, but you have to continue to court it. You still have to continue to build upon that relationship between you and your spiritual believer in order to move side by side
Sure.
to get through it. And one of the things that I noticed that's missing, to answer your question again, is empathy.
Mm.
And I don't necessarily know if empathy has lost its role when it comes to our spiritual practice,
Mm.
but I know it's essential to it, because
Gotcha.
if you have that in your spiritual practice, then you will be more mindful on how you interact with people who are grieving a loss.
Mm.
So
Mm.
I believe just having empathy, whether you are a Christian, whether you are following that of a Islamic, whether you're from Buddha, Judaism, Catholicism,
Yeah.
I think empathy itself surpasses all of those of religion. It's that of a
Yeah.
spiritual realm. So if
Yeah.
you have that, then that should be helping guide you to how you interact with people who are dealing with a loss.
Mm. Yeah, I agree. I agree. That's kind of the human component. And the human component and the human experience should be lived with that as probably one of the biggest keys and one of the biggest bullet points of your life. I don't have to agree with you. I don't have to be on the same page. I don't have, but I can still have empathy.
Right.
I can still be a decent human. We don't
Yeah.
have to be on the same page.
Right.
Yeah.
Just just have
Yeah.
that empathy. That empathy it's essential to it's essential to, like, to us, to, in my mind, at like air.
Yeah.
You can't you can't
Absolutely.
you can't have it.
So you have From Grief to Life, and you have your own website with everything that you do on there. I know that when people find you, and you have a podcast where you invite guests and you talk about
Mhm.
different experiences. When people go onto your website, they have the opportunity to reach out to you and just have a conversation, a 20-minute conversation. If I were to reach out, what are the things that you try to discover when you speak to somebody for the first time?
I'm just going to have a conversation with you.
Yeah.
My role at that point is to get to know you and to see whether or not a grief coach is what you need.
Mm.
You may need somebody who is a counselor and a therapist. And the difference between what they do and what I do is that when you're working with a counselor and a therapist, they have a tendency to want to go back to see exactly what it is that got you to this point. As for myself and those of us who are coaches, we work with you where you are right now. We help
Mm.
formulate the plan or the blueprint to help you move forward with your grief. So that's really, and plus I can't give you no Percocet. I can't give you no prescriptions.
But I
So
ain't coming. I ain't coming.
I'm just saying, if you're looking for that script, I
Hmm.
can't get you no script.
Right.
But
Right.
I can definitely provide you with resources as far as, what would be the best for you at that moment. Because again, you may be grieving now regarding the loss of, say, your sibling.
Mm.
However, there might have been some stuff that had been unresolved prior to that person passing away that you might need some deeper healing through. So that might require you to see that psychotherapist. That might require you to see a psychiatrist or a counselor, or somebody who is going to dive backwards, where I'm focusing on the present moment and hoping to help you, support you as you are learning to heal yourself.
Mm. We talked a little bit about how difficult it is emotionally to even get into the realm of grief and even to speak on it. But you've decided to have a podcast as well. Why did you decide
Oh,
on a podcast when speaking the words of grief and that level of emotion is always so difficult? Why a podcast?
at the time when this podcast started, it was getting close to the homegoing anniversaries of my parents. Let me briefly explain. So, in 2018, my father passed away March 1st, 2018, and my mother had passed away on February 27th, 2020. Now, this just shows you how God, the universe works. When my father passed away, we had his homegoing service on March 5th, 2018, around 11 o'clock. It started at 11.
Mhm.
When my mother had her homegoing service, it was March 5th, 2020, at 6 o'clock in the evening. So I had both my parents' homegoing services to the exact same day, a few hours apart from each other.
Wow.
That was a very emotional time for me. And I had something to say, and I
Well,
had to get it off my chest.
yeah.
And so I was like, you know what? I'm going to do this. I'm going to take a leap of faith. People have been like, you should do a podcast. And okay. And it just so happens that this year, March 5th, I had already decided the days I was going to do it. I'm like, okay, I'm going to do it on Sundays, blah, 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 blah,
Yes.
blah. And it just so happens that March 5th was on a Sunday. So I was
Isn't
like,
that
okay.
something?
I said, talk about, increment. I can't even talk right now. I'm getting
Yeah.
emotional. But you
Yeah.
understand
I
what I'm
get it.
saying. You see how the universe
Absolutely.
sets it all up.
Yep.
So it just went from there. And then the following Sunday was March 12th. And in 2021, March 12th happens to be the day that my first love, my college boyfriend, unfortunately, he passed away.
Mm.
So it just kind of lined up and it just went from there.
I applaud you for stepping into that space because it doesn't
Mm.
sound easy at all. What I find is a lot of the emotional professions, the emotional tasks that we take on are born out of that same or very similar experiences. So now
Mhm.
you have a podcast, you coach people and help them to mend. And I know that somebody's out there listening right now, trying to find out what to do, they might go to fromgriefto life.com and try and figure it out. But for somebody that's watching and listening to us now, what are three things? They could be misconceptions, they could be whatever, but what are three things that people really need to understand about grief?
3 things they need to understand about grief is, number 1, there's no blueprint to this. The grief journey, it's a roller coaster ride. Here's the best way I can describe when it comes to grief. Think of the 10 scariest roller coaster rides in the country. Now put all of those roller coaster rides together. And you're on it.
Yeah.
Nonstop. That's grief. Because you don't know when you're going to be up. You don't know when you're going to be down. You don't know when you're going to be going all the way around. But that's the grief journey itself. That it's a roller coaster ride. There's going to be moments when you're going to be like, hey, I'm feeling good. And then you'll hear a song that just takes you back to, well, this is Nana's favorite song. Or the last time I saw Nana was at our reunion last year when she made that banana pudding, you know? So it's a ride.
Yeah.
Number 2 about grief. Again, it's not something you can get over. You can't get around it. You can't get underneath it. You have to really learn to go through it. And you going through it may require you to crawl first.
Gotcha.
In fact, it may not even require you to crawl. The first thing you might need to do is just stand and breathe. Let's be clear. You might just be like, just take a breath.
Yeah.
And then guess what? You may be able to make that first step there and take another breath. You know, sometimes you just have to stand in the midst of that storm.
Yeah.
And the third thing is to understand and recognize that it is part of the journey we signed up for in this life. We're all going to encounter it one way or another, whether it's directly or indirectly. Now, how we give ourselves permission to handle it, that's an entirely different situation. But we are not, it's unavoidable.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of people in our age range, unfortunately, who have lost their parents the last couple of years.
Yeah.
And it's hard to ever imagine that our parents, our elders are not with us when they've made it here so long, you know?
Yeah.
However, that is how the order of things is supposed to be. No parent ever wants to outlive their child. So it's part of the process. So did I answer your questions?
You did. Thank you for that. And that helps to shed a lot of light. I love the word that you said, give yourself permission. I think that is huge. And I liken it back to empathy. We have to have it for others, as well as we have to give it to ourselves too.
Absolutely. We have to give ourselves empathy. We have to give ourselves grace.
Yeah.
Grace is essential. It's given to us. So, and if our spiritual believer that we all go to, or those who may be, you know, somewhere lingering, if it's within us, why not give it to ourselves? So yeah.
Ahira, thank you so much for being here and sharing your
having me.
Absolutely. This is for many, this is a difficult conversation, but it's also a refreshing one. You know, sometimes when we're faced with difficulties, it's so refreshing to know that there's hope, and it's so encouraging to know that there's help and that we're not alone in whatever the situation or the circumstance is. And I'm so thankful that you've answered the call and you've started on, you know, your journey with this, helping people along this journey. You likened it to a roller coaster. Listen, I don't ride those. I'm at the concession stand with my corn dog. So I'm like,
where's the coffee? You ain't got no coffee. Yo, coffee and a corn dog. That don't sound
coffee and a corn dog. That's what I'm gonna get a T-shirt.
I don't
coffee and a corn dog. But Ahira, thank you so much.
You're so welcome. I'm glad I was here. Coffee and a corn dog. Okay.
Coffee and a corn dog. That's Ahira Smith from grieftolife.com. Make sure you check her out and see everything that she offers. Read about why it's offered and know that we all grieve something, and there is help, and there are resources that we can use to better walk the path and this journey called life. One of the takeaways today is it doesn't matter what someone else is going through. It doesn't matter what you believe. It doesn't matter what differences you have. We all can be decent humans and show empathy, show that we care, and show that we are understanding just of the journey, because we're all on the same one. So, as usual, you are the best you in the world. For more about Ahira, please visit phillipawork.com and fromgriefToLife.com. And we will see you later next time here on The Phillip Show.
Don't wait.